So good afternoon, everyone. And I want to say thank you so much for working with us through our technical difficulties, but we are here now. So I am honored to be moderating today's panel. Before we begin, I definitely want to hold space for global grief that is going on. Death is a universal experience. Unfortunately, access to a dignified and affordable end-of-life plan is not accessible for everyone. Many individuals, especially those in underserved and marginalized communities, face a significant barrier when we're talking about securing necessary funds and resources for that respectful end of life. Can you please explain the term public guardian and the key strategies to improve accessibility and affordability in death care for the legally incapacitated individuals?
Sure. My name's Mel. Hi, everybody. Hi. Thank you for having me here. And is there any public guardians here today? Anybody that serves the public as a guardian? No. So I learned about public guardians through the funeral director on our team named Tracy Denver. And as we understand, public guardians are meant to help serve the people who cannot serve themselves for whatever reason, incarceration or mental incapacity or whatever the purpose is that they are not able to take care of their personal affairs. In doing that, the public guardian helps to serve the person during their lifespan. But then as death occurs, there is a bridge and gap, and I'll say a gap in that reach of communication. So I can get more into that. I know that Dr. Haneman has some time constraints, so I'd like to pass it back to her. If that's, you want to give me a sign when you're ready?
Yeah,
okay, I just don't want to take too much time. So as cemetery keepers at Life Forest, I'm going to be using this. People that know me know I have tangent problems. So we're going to keep in line here. As cemetery keepers at Life Forest, we had made a commitment to legacy protection, dignity, and equality of all lives lived. 5 years ago, Life Forest Director of Burial Services, Tracy Denver, approached me and asked if Life Forest would donate a burial plot to a man whom died in the care of a public guardian several years prior. With Life Forest growth economy, gift economy, of course I said yes. This in turn grew into what we have coined Life Forest Guardianship Burial Program. We have since provided upwards of 100 burial plots at no cost or sliding fee scale, both pre-need and at need, to public guardian clients across the state of New Hampshire and beyond. And why is this so important? Because when we bury this individual as a state-recognized cemetery, then we ensure state vital record recording. We also deed record the names of the deceased to the cemetery land deed itself. This, in turn, has allowed friends and loved ones of the deceased to find them again. The sad part, most do not even know that their loved one has passed away. In fact, none of them who has found us knew that their loved one had passed. And how did they find this person? They entered their name in a Google search. And in that search came up the deed recording to public record. And they're like, what is this place? Who are you and what's going on? And to be the bearer of that news is very unfortunate. However, what we understand is that public guardians are tasked with life care of an individual. But when that person dies, the guardian contacts the family member that they are assigned to contact. But as we all know, no man is an island, and that person may not have had a positive relationship with the deceased. This is how legacies are lost and ancestral trauma can build. So our PhD candidate at the Department of Anthropology at Johns Hopkins University, a young lady by the name of Sasha Kramer, has researched this through a burial at Life Forest Whistle Ridge in Maine. When she interviewed descendants of a man named William Harland, a man who died 85 years ago and was left abandoned in a copper can with over 3,500 other souls. His descendants didn't even know he existed. This is multiple generations later. The reconnection to his great-grandchildren was able to connect a lot of dots of history, trauma, and illness for this family. If ancestral connection happens to be important to your death care work, I encourage you to watch Library of Dust and feel confident that you and your passionate work makes a huge impact in healing generational trauma. Thank you.
Now, Heather, can you please give us an overview of what indigent disposition programs are and a sampling of those that exist?
As we're learning today, in the United States, dying indigent carries with it a social stigma for having lived a life as seen as less than, and that leaves you alone and penniless at death. So for clarity, the term indigent refers to extreme poverty, lacking the basic resources for a normal life. Other definitions of indigence include poor, needy, impoverished, destitute. The old-fashioned term was pauper. Note, however, indigent does not have any connection to indigenous. There is some avoidance of the term indigent due to this misconception. Funeral poverty is a term that means that there may be some resources, but not enough to cover the exorbitant costs of the majority of contemporary funeral services and/or disposition options. The term indigent disposition program sometimes refers to assistance programs for truly indigent individuals with no resources. And sometimes the term is used to refer to those experiencing funeral poverty, those who find themselves without resources to cover the often unexpected expense of a funeral or body disposition, such as cremation or burial. By the way, this is very similar to medical indigence or medical poverty, where you may have enough resources to just cover your basic living expenses, but not the ability to cover, say, a typical bill for a hospitalization or other expensive medical treatment. Or in a legal setting, a defendant who is indigent has the constitutional right to court-appointed representation according to the 1963 Supreme Court decision. Many locales, and this varies what the locales are. It could be the state, it could be a county, parish, municipality, etc., have some sort of assistance program for disposition. Some have enough funds to cover simple burials as well. The newly formed Equitable Disposition Alliance, which I'm representing today, is planning to launch a database to record and track such disposition programs nationally. And you can find them at equitabledisposition.org. And I would like to announce that the Equitable Disposition Alliance is now a finalist for the Order of the Good Death grant to help create this database. And Isabel's going to help us with it. Okay, we're finalists. Yeah, good. Cheer us on as we go through. Anyhow, So in Massachusetts, for example, the State Department of Transitional Assistance manages a program whereby individuals, family members, or funeral directors can apply for a maximum of $1,100 in benefits to cover final disposition costs, and therefore acts more like a funeral poverty program. In the cases where the deceased is unknown, known but unclaimed by next of kin or others willing to apply for the DTA funds or otherwise take responsibility for the bills, the state medical examiner's office recently has taken responsibility for these cases and uses the $1,100, then adds as needed up to $1,000 of their own funds and contracts themselves with the local cemetery for simple burial. Excuse me. Thus acting more like an indigent disposition program. This is a temporary solution to a very complicated and difficult set of circumstances that I'll cover in the next category when we get into challenges and gaps. But briefly, other indigent or funeral poverty programs have assistance that range from none to here in Washington. It does vary by county. The Department of Social and Health Services can provide up to possibly $300 may be available.
My name is Victoria Haneman. Thank you for having me come to speak today. I was thrilled to be invited. For those of you who are not familiar with my work, I write about the economics of death care and potentially using tax incentives to try to address concerns about funeral poverty. Funeral insurance is a nightmare that, as a financial product, I would recommend to pretty much no one. And financial instruments that spread payments over time are a meaningful and effective way to approach poverty and poverty mitigation. The problem here is that the industry itself should not be managing these financial instruments. There is a check and balance problem with prepaid death instruments. I've proposed repurposing the 529 educational infrastructure that's currently used to incentivize savings for higher education to provide accounts that would allow people to save for death. 529 accounts are right now the fastest growing investment product, one of the fastest growing investment products in the US. And a fair criticism of these plans is that they really benefit the wealthy, but this is a problem with the way in which the accounts are incentivized and used, more so than a structure problem. These accounts can be used in a progressive way with deposits and matching from state and municipalities to help lower income taxpayers. This type of change would only require a simple amendment to the Internal Revenue Code. Basically, the plan would be made spend down eligible for Medicaid if irrevocable, and there can be a named funeral agent designated on the account to arrange for use of funds on death. And we can even route any remaining balances so that remaining balances are not forfeited. This plan that I'm proposing is a way to broaden the social safety net through tax incentivized savings in a political climate where there's absolutely no bipartisan agreement at the moment. And it would be difficult to pass any major spending measure to broaden the social safety net. I believe it's an idea that can catalyze major change without investment into new infrastructure.
Many communities face disparities in access to culturally appropriate and affordable end-of-life care. How can death care professionals aim to address culturally sensitive care alongside affordability?
Okay, I heard the question. Thank you. How can death care professionals aim to address cultural sensitivity alongside affordability? Where do I begin with this issue? When you're talking about death care, if we're talking about insurance, funeral, burial, last rites, it's been engulfed in an issue or a topic of consumerism. And there has been this kind of tug of war, right? The consumer has the right. This is the bereaved family. The bereaved, we are in a terribly fragile position, right? But we have to make what may be the most important decision of our lives in just a few hours and just a few days, right? Trying to, buy service for death care. And I think when you're looking at particularly the Black community in the United States, we have to understand that Black folks just got access to being a consumer. That's really been controlled, I think, historically. And in this way of consumers, we have not been able to really we have not been able to really define how we want to, how do I want to put this? We have been caught up in this web of the ostentatious funeral, where we've been labeled to spend too much money on a casket, or spend too much money on flowers, or too much money, on food. And I think what the broader white majority society looking at this, I don't think they understand that that's respect and care work for Black folks within this kind of consumer market. And I think being culturally sensitive really is just about trying to understand what these death waves mean for folks. If you see folks in the Black community that may not have advanced death care directives, they may not have a will, they may not have life insurance, and you're making judgments about them having a GoFundMe, or them not knowing their rights. I think there's just more to understanding what those last rites rituals, why it seems that they are buying a funeral package that's above their means. Well, in Black society, even if we're talking about different religious groups, if we're talking about different income brackets or different ages, there's still this idea that the way that I put away my the last rites rituals that are performed by or for my loved one, that equals to how much I cared for them, right? Because in society, they may not have been given the respect that they deserve, but with these last rites rituals, I will give them that respect. So I really think a lot of it is just education that gets wrapped up in this community cannot afford X, Y, Z. Why are they trying to, pay all this money for this funeral? And I think there's a historical component of consumerism that we're really missing here. And I think it's beyond the idea that, and that's the last point I really want to make. I think it's beyond the idea of Black folks just need to get a will, or Black folks just need to, understand their rights. In this white supremacist society, knowing that you could keep the body in your home for a day or 2 days, or knowing that you could transport the body, just because we have rights does not mean those rights are protected. And so again, I just think there's a lot of pulling apart historically and trying to understand what these last rituals mean to Black folks.
Thank you, Dr. Fletcher. Victoria, coming to you. So what role do you see funeral homes, cemeteries, and other death care providers in advocating for and potentially managing the 529 style savings plans for their clients? You're on mute.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Wonderful. This is where I get cynical. I mean, I'm cynical all the time, but this is when I'm particularly cynical. Death care providers draw a large portion of their revenue frequently from prepayment plans, sometimes as much as 1/3 of their revenue. And so I would assume that many death care providers are going to oppose 529 savings plans for death. It does not really help the industry in terms of shifting investment away from prepayment instruments that they have a heavy hand in managing. And their business models frequently hinge on lock-in effect of prepayment plans. It doesn't necessarily do anything to increase consumer spending and can seriously impact revenue, which is why I think we should be focusing on this approach.
You and your colleagues have researched. What are some of the challenges, or should I say gaps, for those who are intending to receive the benefits of those that are providing the services?
Okay. By the general public, as well as those in need. In Massachusetts and elsewhere, programs cover only up to a certain amount, which hasn't risen with inflation and goes directly to the funeral homes. In Massachusetts, funeral directors report that it takes about 9 months for the payments to go through the system and then for them to see it, leaving many bodies in limbo. A story in point, a compassionate funeral director in Massachusetts who accepted these indigent disposition cases had his license suspended due to delays in getting authorization to cremate, resulting in complaints due to decomposing bodies at his funeral home. Caitlin Doty heard about it and came to Massachusetts and made a video on this that she goes into much more depth that we have time for today. And you can find that on her YouTube channel, Should This Funeral Director Be Forgiven?
Awesome, thank you. Mel, so what role do you think funeral directors and cemeterians play in supporting public guardians through the end-of-life process, particularly when there are limited resources available?
On the speaker?
No, it's not.
How about now? Now? All right. I think I'd like to start with a very oversimplified answer, especially when listening to the thoughts of Dr. Fletcher around consumerism. I am originally not from death care. I'm just a person that was taking care of somebody and lost that person to a terrible disease and found myself here through a passion project called Life Forest. And as the cemetery was being created, I realized something. I didn't really know how to build economy in death, because it was like all of a sudden, and I'm not negating the importance of makeup, but it wasn't like you were selling makeup, you know. It was really important, and I thought to myself, how can this be done in a way that fills my pocket? And there's only one. That house becomes so ridiculously expensive. So there's this perception that you can only grow economy through creation of scarcity. And it just didn't sit right with me. And I felt like, well, how can this happen? Like, how can I make this happen in a way that feels right? And I was able to experience and learn about something called gift economy. I've included in your pre-read packets a beautiful article about that, and I encourage you to read it. If you're in the death care profession, the creation of abundance by giving everything you can, support when they don't have support, and it doesn't have to be about money at all. And I think what you're finding is that unlike a lot of things in life where there's like a yes or no, or there's binary answers. Death and grief it's just such a myriad of emotional response. There is no sales button that you can click that's going to answer to everybody's call. You know, some people want that fancy thing, and there's nothing wrong with that. If that's what makes their heart heal, wonderful. Some people want as simple as possible, and that's okay too. There are no wrong answers. And I want to circle back to our guardianship program. As we learn passes away and they are under the age of 20, they can't even have their own car, and like they don't have insurance. They're not, these parents shouldn't have to qualify financially. It doesn't matter that you lose a child, your loss is so, you cannot replace that with money. It doesn't matter your wealth or your non-wealth. That person should not have to pay to bury their child. And that is how we felt about it. And so as we gift and gift and gift, we grow and grow and grow. I'm going to give the first example and shut my mic off or throw a carrot at me if I take too long. Okay, my friend here, Rebecca, knows her job. When we first started Life Forest, a young kid came up. And let me tell you, it wasn't pretty. It was like a pile of Life Forest was very simple in its beginnings. But this young man rode his bike up to this spot. And as I was building a bench, he said to me, "Oh my goodness, is this a cemetery?" And I said, "Yeah, that's what we're doing." And he's like, "Oh, can I buy a plot for my sister?" And I said, "Well, let me talk to your mom. Like, we don't charge to bury. Let me work with you." So I worked with his mother, and we provided a beautiful burial for this amazing young lady named Ariana, who passed away by crossing the street on New Year's Eve and was hit by a plow. It was catastrophic, the loss that this family endured. And so I felt really good about it. We provided a burial. It was beautiful. Him and his family were very thankful. And you know what? Felt good. But you know what? The next week I was sitting there working on the land, and a car pulled in. And it was Ariana's mom. And out came Eric, a teenage kid. And he says, "Hi, Mel. I'm here to help." I said, "Oh, okay, thanks." And he took our tiny little lawnmower and mowed a 13-acre trail. And as he came back, I ruffled through my wallet and I had like $5. Like, you know, and I said, "Oh, Eric, you know, I have $5. Like, it's all I got, but next time I'll get you." And he said, "Mel, are you kidding me? You buried my sister. I want to take care of this trail for you." And every single week, that young man showed up for an entire season and a half and mowed a 13-acre trail and would not accept a penny. And do you know what? The value of what I would have had to pay somebody to mow that trail far outcost the value of what that single burial plot was. And so you circle back to gift economy. This young lady that asked me, Tracy, our burial services, "Can you please provide this burial?" So of course, we buried this person. Family called. I didn't know. They didn't know that he had passed. And guess what? They bought 2 plots, one on either side of this person, so they could be together again. One gift brought back 2 plot reservations. So I really encourage you in your death care services to consider what you can offer to others, because that abundance will feed back to you. So, and I can't state it better than Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's a glorious author and poet, but I do encourage you to read that because it really changed me. And thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Victoria. All right, so an a tax sheltered savings accounts sounds like a great tool for future planning. But how do we address the immediate accessibility challenges for those who need assistance right now and they haven't had an opportunity to save?
A great question. In supporting those in need, we need to not underestimate the role of deservingness narratives, meaning many people in our society feel that things like education, housing, and death are things that people should be saving to provide for themselves. And to make matters worse, death has this added stigma of being a topic that no one except for us wants to talk about. I think that one of the things we need to do immediately to address accessibility challenges has already been raised today, and it is to address regulatory pathways and to really understand the urgency of addressing the regulatory pathways. We are instead relying on things like GoFundMe to support an inadequate social safety net in this area because of deservingness narratives failing. And regulation change is really urgent in this space, not just in the context discussed this morning by Professor Marsh, but also regulatory pathways to allow direct-to-consumer cremation to be facilitated on a national basis, which we know can eventually reduce costs. We need to remove gatekeeping barriers and broaden competition. We have historical data that this will bring down costs.
What are the most significant barriers faced by individuals who die without financial resources? And how do these barriers impact their end-of-life care as well as the deposition options?
Let me see how I want to address that, because I'm thinking about historically, Black folks just got access to being able to define where they're buried. And I just don't think we can forget about that. I have an article in a book that I've just co-authored with Ashley Toll called Grave History, and it talks about Jim Crow burial ground. And the latest Jim Crow burial ground that I researched was just in 2021. And what I mean by that is the same way we have racial covenants in homes, saying that this is where Black folks, you cannot buy a house here. This is off limits to you. It's legal. It's the law. The very same thing in burial. So that when we ask these questions about barriers, I think they're very important questions. But I think when you're talking about communities of color, if we're talking about indigenous folks, if we're talking about immigrant groups, if we're talking about Black folks, historically marginalized groups, we have to understand that this idea of being able to be buried where you want to be buried, that's a new concept, right? And it's still very strained by this white supremacist, society, ethnocentric society, that we live in. But tell me that last part of the question, Ashley, that you were asking about these barriers.
Yeah, how do the barriers impact end-of-life care and their deposition options?
Okay, right, just where you're buried. So yeah, that's really important to remember. And for those of you who do not know what Jim Crow laws are, period, we're talking about from 1896 until 1965, Black folks did not have access to public spaces. And these were burial grounds that were sanctioned by public dollars. You had a white burial ground, you had a Black burial ground, and they were not kept up. So I just really want us to understand how deeply sanctioned by our cities, our counties, our government, that these barriers are that's impacting end of life. If we're talking about burial and where people are being buried. Indigenous folks, for example, it's been in the news. These Indian schools, right? These Native American schools, and they call them these Indian boarding schools, a terrible term, but these schools had cemeteries. And this is what people are trying to wrap their mind around, why does a school have a cemetery? Because these children were never meant to go back home. This is their new home. They're going to be assimilated, or, you know, they're going to die here. So I think when we look at these barriers, we have to look at how socially constructed and normalized these barriers just are for Black folks, and again, people of color, just being buried in peace, resting in peace. Many of the artifacts are in our museum of Indigenous folks that they hold dear. So these barriers, again, run deep, and it's not just about what funeral workers can do, but this is really about how socially constructed our laws are. So maybe more on that if folks have more questions that I could clear some things up, but I just don't think it's as simple as you know, one barrier or one thing. This stuff is codified in who we are as Americans. We don't allow people of color to have access, ownership of their own burial grounds. I write a lot about that, and then just what that means.
Dr. Fletcher. All right, so we are coming to the last 5 minutes of our panel discussion, and I want to ask each of our panelists to take a minute to share some known or available affordable resources, and it could be within the death care programs as such. Want to start off, Victoria?
Let me tell you, because I write about why prepaid death option instruments are not the way to go. The article, if you're interested, is in Harvard Journal and Legislation. I do try to give people an alternative. Right now, I tell people to put their money into a POD, a payable on death savings account, with a clear plan in writing that is not in their will given to their loved one who is designated on that POD account.
Dr. Fletcher, do you have any resources you'd like to share?
I would like for everyone, I would encourage everyone to become change agents. It's not just a simple fix. Like I said, this stuff is a part of our society. And us over here at the Collective for Radical Death Studies, we have an entire radical death canon where folks can really get educated on these issues. If you really want to know how deep they go, we provide Rad Death Reads every other month. We have one going on talking about queering death and issues that's going on there. It'll start at the beginning of October. And these things are, you know, very, very inexpensive. So I would definitely encourage folks to get educated and to learn the history. One last thing, this idea of the grubby, greedy undertaker, that's a dominant white narrative. I've written about and I've researched what it means to do death care in the Black community is very different. Bartering system, lots of different things that are going on. Not to say that this was not an economy. That is not what I'm saying. These folks definitely became wealthy, but the ways in which they approached it was just not this idea of being capitalist. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.